So, I wanted, that's my agenda today, to really talk about this way of thinking and really flipping the script on anxiety, as I say here in the title, and really thinking about whether we can turn this emotion into an ally instead of an enemy. Now, before I launch into that, though, I want to tell you a story. And this story is set in space. And yes, I am a sci-fi nerd. That's true, but this is not science fiction. This is actually a real story from real life. And so this is a picture taken of Dr. Scott Parazynski, who was stationed on the International Space Station a number of years ago. And he became very famous around this time for what we see him doing right here, which is to conduct the longest EVA, or spacewalk, in history. And he did it to repair a crucial solar array that was powering the International Space Station. It really had to be fixed, or there was going to be some trouble. And I had the immense pleasure of meeting him a few years back and interviewing him. And I just had to ask him about this amazing feat of endurance. And it was a feat of endurance because he was out there for 7 nail-biting hours, repairing this panel, hanging, really connected to the safety of the space station by this robotic arm connected to his feet. So he's essentially flying in space, needing to use, he was a trained surgeon. He needed to use his surgical skills. So complex was this repair job that needed to be done on the array. He was out there for 7 hours, dangling in the vacuum of space with nothing but a spacesuit between him and the void. And I just had to ask him, how did you do it? What was your secret sauce? And his answer was actually anxiety and his ability to harness it. Because when Scott jumped into the unknown, Dr. Parazynski, it was anxiety that narrowed his attention. It was anxiety that helped channel his energy, got his blood pumping to help him endure through all those hours so he could remain energized and laser focused on his mission. And it was anxiety that prompted him to run all the what if simulations in his head that he had to, as he was thinking about everything that could go wrong and everything that could go right. So he was prepared for any eventuality. And as we were talking about anxiety in this way, that it prepared him to be ready for this crisis, to perform at his peak. We saw anxiety in this way, but that's not the way that we typically see anxiety. That's not the story we tell about anxiety most of the time, because this is how we think of anxiety, right? We think of it in terms of anxiety disorders and the mental health crisis that we're very clearly seeing that's been gaining momentum over really the past 10 or 15 years, including over the pandemic, but not limited to it. And of the mental health disorders, anxiety disorders are the most common. 1/3 of us will be diagnosed with an anxiety disorder in our lifetime. That's well over 100 million people in the US alone. And anxiety disorders are also on the rise. Again, not just over the past couple of years, but over the past decade or more. But as a mental health professional, as someone who's been trained in clinical psychology and as someone who's a cognitive neuroscience and has conducted research for 20 years, I'm actually really preoccupied with a mystery as I think about these statistics. And the mystery is that as I've been a professional over the past 20 years, we have gained incredible amounts of knowledge about anxiety disorders in particular, how to treat them, what neurobiological mechanisms underlying anxiety, how we see them develop over childhood and beyond. We have many excellent therapies. We have science-based wellness practices. We know about mind-body connection. Why is all this knowledge not keeping pace with the public health crisis we're facing? So the mystery is that if we know more than ever before, why isn't all this working? And this question is really what drove me to write the book, frankly, and to sort of breach the walls of academia a bit and start to really ponder this question, because I have an answer. It's not the entire answer, but in this world that already amplifies anxiety, because it's challenging, it's uncertain, there's so many disparities, both in accessing mental health, disparities in education. I mean, you name them, we know about these disparities. But even in that context, we should be doing better than we are. But we mental health professionals have made a really big mistake. We've been telling you the wrong things about anxiety. We've convinced people to fear anxiety. We've convinced people that when they feel anxious, they're broken or sick. Now, not only are these beliefs false, but they actually directly make anxiety worse. And they block us from benefiting from all the excellent treatments and therapies that we do have out there when we want and need that extra support when we're struggling. So today, my mission is to really, as a beginning step, before I really talk about actionable ways to work with anxiety in the classroom, we need to break down these false beliefs about anxiety in our personal work and our work lives. And we need to talk about, how do we get here? How do we start to treat anxiety as an enemy? And what's the roadmap for making it better? The crux of what I'll be saying today, to put it in a nutshell, is what I might think of as the anxiety paradox. And that's this idea that we actually need to feel this difficult human emotion. It's part of the human condition. And we need to feel it in order to live well with it. And when we do, not only will we manage anxiety better, but we'll even be able to leverage it towards making our lives better. So we'll cope better with it when we actually allow ourselves to feel it. And we'll find ways where we can see, like science has told us for decades, and even well over 100 years, as a matter of fact, that anxiety evolved to be our ally. And when we harness it to work with it in classrooms, at home, wherever we are, we can make our lives better. So if I'm right about this, if indeed anxiety can be an ally, as counterintuitive as that sounds, how do we get here? How do we start to treat anxiety as an enemy? And really, we have to start with language, because language is about the stories that we tell, the discussions we have, the expectations we have about anxiety. And when you pop anxiety into a browser, into a search, into the internet, and you ask it to spit out word clouds, you know that when you put in a word, and it will, in a word cloud, it will show you the other words that tend to be associated with it, and words that are larger are more frequently associated with it in text searches. When I say the word anxiety, stop a moment and think, what words come to mind? Okay, so hold those words in your mind. And here are some of the word clouds I got when I Googled it, and probably some of these words came up for you as well. A lot of people, when I ask this question, when I'm giving in-person talks, people will say fear, stress, the typical kinds of feelings that feel like anxiety. But one thing you can notice here about the word cloud is that the words that tend to be very common also with anxiety, commonly associated with it, are words like trauma, PTSD, phobia, desperate, disorder. So here, what we can see very clearly is that the language we use about anxiety is one of dysfunction and despair. And this matters. This is not just a by the by. This matters because our language powerfully shapes our mindset about anxiety. And from a psychological perspective, a mindset is what we believe and perceive about an experience, and therefore how we respond to it accordingly. So this language of dysfunction and despair drives two key mindsets about anxiety that really dominate our society. One you can think of as the disease mindset, and another you can think of as a character flaw mindset. With a disease mindset, you have the sense that because anxiety feels bad, and it does, it feels terrible, we assume it's dangerous. We assume it's probably linked to a trauma, and at the least, we assume that it's a fracture in a well-working mind. It's something, something's wrong. There's a malfunction that we need to fix. Anxiety is a danger signal. On the other side, we have what we can think of as a character flaw mindset. And here, when people adhere to this perspective, they often kind of go through life as a warrior, right? So they feel that being anxious is a weakness. It indicates a lack of willpower. And anyway, warriors don't feel anxiety and other vulnerable emotions in the first place. So it's sort of a failure to have it even show up. Now, these are two kind of complementary sets of beliefs, two complementary mindsets. But interestingly, when you analyze it, they really converge on one single solution when it comes to actually managing anxiety in our life. And that one single solution is avoidance. Now, what do we mean by avoidance? What I mean by avoidance is that when anxiety shows up, the idea is not to go through it. You have to go around it. You have to suppress it. You have to avoid it. You have to make sure you just kind of have to get rid of it as soon as possible. Soothe it, go around, not through. The second way we experience avoidance when it comes especially to anxiety and other difficult emotions is our view is that, well, we have to eradicate it. Because if it's a disease or a malfunction, we have to treat it like a cancer. We have to get rid of it as soon as possible because of its danger. And so this sort of way of this approach to eradicate it doesn't leave any room for anxiety to exist in our life. And then a third way we express avoidance is really what you can think of as protection mode. And this is often a mode that we take, a stance we take not just towards ourselves, but towards our loved ones or people that we are responsible for in our life, like our students. So here the idea is that we don't really need to prepare people for this terrible emotion. Rather, we should protect them from it. So we want to, if we're doing our job right, we prevent people from ever feeling it in the first place, anxiety and these difficult emotions. We protect them. Now, all of these ways that we avoid are coming from the best possible impulse, right? We want to protect, we want to make people feel good, we want to be safe and healthy. But the problem is that we know from decades and decades and decades of psychological research and practice that avoidance is literally the recipe for making anxiety worse. There's no worse solution to constantly and consistently avoid anxiety. And that's because of multiple reasons. One is that we know that, and you know this intuitively, I probably don't have to tell you this or cite research. Anything we try to suppress or push down, it always comes back stronger, right? And we see this in our emotions. We see this in our thinking. If I say, don't think of a white bear, right? That's that famous white bear phenomenon. A white bear is always going to pop into our mind's eye. It's really how humans operate, and our emotions are the same. But this second kind of linchpin in how avoidance makes anxiety worse, I think is really important to consider. And that's that it's an opportunity cost. And what I mean by this is that when we avoid anxiety, we're not having opportunities to build coping skills. How can you cope with something that you never allow yourself or your loved ones to feel in the first place? So by avoiding, we're really preventing ourselves from building a positive state of mental health, building skills, building coping. And this is so crucial to, I think I went backwards instead of forward. Let me try that again. There we go. And this is so crucial because when we're not building these skills, when we're avoiding, when we're refusing to engage in the human experience of anxiety, we're also blocking the benefits of gold standard therapy. And we're even creating more risk for anxiety disorders. That's because, and this might be a really good place to talk about the difference between anxiety, the emotion, and anxiety disorders. If you struggle with an anxiety disorder, the gold standard treatment at this time is cognitive behavioral therapy. And when you go and receive cognitive behavioral therapy, the thing you will be taught to do is it's called one way of doing it in CBT is exposure and response prevention therapy. Exposure is that you expose yourself to the thing that's making you anxious, to those anxiety-provoking experiences you go through, not around. And the response prevention is you prevent yourself from avoiding anxiety. So this way of engaging with anxiety and building skills is chapter and verse how the best therapy we have out there proceeds. And yet, the way we message about anxiety is telling us to do the opposite of what we know to do. And so that by the time anxiety has started to go down this path towards anxiety disorders because of avoidance, because of a lack of building skills, we're sort of asking people then to engage with anxiety and not avoid it. Whereas I think we should be telling people about that from the very get-go when they experience anxiety anywhere on the spectrum. So this is a really crucial distinction. And anxiety disorders are only diagnosed when the ways that we're coping with anxiety are getting in the way of living life well. It's called functional impairment. So when the way we cope, which is typically avoidance in anxiety disorders, if we're socially anxious and we stop going to work, we cut off from friends, we are missing deadlines, and we're not able to do things because we're so concerned, for example, about social humiliation or judgment or failing, that's when a diagnosis is given, not just because you're having the anxious experience. So this is a way of thinking about anxiety that is so crucial to building a positive mental health state, but yet we have the wrong mindset. So that in a real sense, anxiety has a PR problem. And I don't mean that in a glib way, although I do love this cartoon series, The Awkward Yeti. All of the, he or she, I don't know actually who the Awkward Yeti is, but they only draw organs. This is a brain and heart. And through this, really expressing all sorts of psychological principles. And here, we have so much anxiety about our anxiety. We have a PR problem because the story we tell, right? That's what PR is all about. These are our mindsets about anxiety. It is actually making avoidance unavoidable. We cannot, when we think of anxiety as a disease or a character flaw, we are primed to do all the unhelpful things when it comes to anxiety and fewer of the helpful things, which I'll talk a lot more about in just a moment. And so this leads really to an inescapable conclusion that we need a new mindset, a mindset reset, if you will, before we can really start to cope and make some headway in the mental health crisis we're seeing when it comes to anxiety disorders. Now, I'm not the first to say that. If there are any philosophers in the house, you may know that the Danish philosopher Kierkegaard wrote a whole book about anxiety 180 years ago. And he wrote something radical. I kind of tried to slog my way through the English translation. I didn't get that far, I have to admit, but I did get to some very fascinating sections with this quote, in which 180 years ago, he wrote, whosoever learns to be anxious in the right way has learned the ultimate. Now, this is radical because of what he's not saying in a way. What he's not saying the ultimate human condition is to have no anxiety. He's not saying that the ultimate is to get rid of anxiety or to conquer it. He says to learn to be anxious in the right way is to learn the ultimate. And in a way, I'm just picking up that ball from Kierkegaard, because a lot of what I want to talk about is what it means to be anxious in the right way. And I also, and you don't have to take an old philosopher's word for it or mine. There's been an immense, just to give you, I can go into this in more detail at the end. I want to sort of get to more actionables a little more quickly. But just to say, there's incredible research in psychology and intervention science that's emerged over the past 10 or 15 years, especially, really showing that when we do use mindset reset interventions, when we teach people to think differently about anxiety, there's massive and rapid, really, positive impact that can happen both in patient populations. Jameson et al. 2013 is citing a study with people diagnosed with social anxiety disorder who were taught to think differently about their anxiety, and then perform a picture here is of this very challenging social stressor called this Trier social stress test. You have to give a speech in front of a panel of judges, which is, of course, kryptonite for someone with social anxiety disorder. And what you see is that when you teach people to think differently about anxiety as a potential asset instead of, an ally instead of an enemy, people perform better. Their cardiovascular profile radically changes. Their heart rate lowers. Their blood pressure lowers. And they look like people who are engaged and actively pursuing a challenge rather than someone who's having a panic attack. And the same work has been applied to, as in this paper in Nature that came out last year, mindset interventions for teens who are struggling with stress and anxiety. So the science is real, the science is promising, and it all hinges on making the shift in what we think about anxiety and how what we do when it shows up. So for the remainder of our time today, I want to really talk about how we actually start to put into practice a mindset reset about anxiety and what that even looks like. And I use this sort of framework that I call the 3 L's to enact a mindset reset in anxiety in our daily lives and in our work lives when we're confronted with our students who are struggling. And the 3 L's stand for listen, leverage, and let go. And this is essentially what we do when anxiety is presented to us, our own, our others in our life, our loved ones. Listen, the first L is listen, which stands for understanding how and why anxiety as an emotion is actually information that's crucial to listen to. The second L is about how we then, understanding its information, can take steps to leverage that for preparation and action and pursuing goals. Rather than be choked by it, we can actually use information that anxiety gives us to take purposeful action. And then, and only then, the third L is let go. This is usually where we start, right, with avoidance, but instead, at that, and then flexibly, after you've tried to listen and leverage, to know when it's time to let go, come back to the present moment, let go of this future hamster wheel that we can be on with anxiety sometimes, and find rejuvenation in the present. So I'm going to talk about each of those steps and give you a kind of actions and ways of thinking about them in each of the categories. Before I do that, I just look at this picture for a moment. Many of you are probably familiar with it. Make a mental note what you see here. And we're going to come back to it at the end. Okay, so the first L is listen. And this, in many ways, I would argue is the most radical of the steps, because listening is the last thing we think to do when anxiety shows up. Because as I was talking about before, our compulsion is to get rid of and soothe anxiety when we feel it and when we see it in others. So listen is in a way, it also is quite radical. Before I talk about what I mean by listen, let's just have a scenario, kind of a concrete scenario in mind, so we can reference it as I'm talking about these different ideas. So here's a scenario many of you may be familiar with as educators. Your student is feeling overwhelmed by the upcoming final exam. Maybe he's come to office hours, maybe he's talking to you after class, but he's alternatively panicking and shutting down. And he just doesn't seem to be able to get back on track or engage in helpful strategies. How do you support him? So the framework that I'm presenting would argue that the very first thing that we should do in that moment, and there's not always a perfect moment to do it, so it's not that you have to do it perfectly the first time this is brought to your attention, but here's what we need to go for in our work with a student, with other people, with ourselves, but also a stance that we take, and that is a stance of curiosity. So someone might come and say, I'm worried about this exam. You're like, okay, don't worry, let's do this. But before we do any of that, we really have to pause on fixing and soothing. If we're really going to accept that anxiety is a normal part of being human. Because when we pause on fixing and soothing, what we're encouraging someone to do is to sit with a feeling. And when people are allowed to sit with feelings, a lot happens. You can start to actually understand what first of all, what you're feeling. So when we're open, when we're curious about emotions, and we know that negative feelings are not automatically bad or damaging, we enter this judgment-free zone and we bring let's say in this student scenario, we bring our students with us. It allows us, and you probably know the phrase, name it to tame it. It allows us to give words and granularity to what can just be a yucky, overwhelming feeling. And the minute you put words to a feeling, you've made it 50% more manageable. There's just no doubt that all the emotion science out there, all of the clinical work with emotions out there, it tells us we have to give words to our feelings before we can work with them. So by being curious and open and not just trying to fix something, we're helping students gain those skills to create a space to understand what they're feeling and to understand that all these feelings are skills to practice, that these are feelings that will come and they will go. And the only way to really start working with them is to work through them. So we're modeling this to our students. I also want to bring up this acronym coming out of the recovery, the 12-step world. I think it's really valuable because we forget about it sometimes. And it's it's HALT. And many of you may be familiar with this. It stands for hungry, angry, lonely, and tired, which is that when we're in any of these states, we're not at our best, right? So a lot of anxiety is driven by, we know all about the mind-body connection. We know if we're not sleeping, if we're eating food that's not, either, we're hungry or, everyone's experienced hangry. Well, there's anxiety as well. If we're not eating food that's healthy and nourishing, if we're lonely, if we're isolated. And so many of us are struggling with loneliness, even in this giant city of ours. We know that loneliness is a public health crisis. Our Surgeon General has even called it out as a public health crisis since he was in the Obama administration before being in the Biden administration. We know that we're tired. If our students are working multiple jobs, we know that that's going to prime this feeling of overwhelming anxiety. Acknowledge that these are factors. It makes it more manageable. It makes it more possible to deal with and to understand what anxiety is telling us is important. And here's where I want to just segue for 2 minutes into this question of how in the world can anxiety tell us anything about what's important? And here's the fact that we have to start with and to remind ourselves, anxiety is an emotion. And let me say that again. Anxiety is an emotion. And I say it in that way to you because often when we say anxiety, we mean anxiety disorder. We mean debilitation. We mean that language of dysfunction and despair. But actually, anxiety is a very specific and fascinating emotion that is distinct from things like fear and stress. And it has a unique place in our evolution because anxiety is an emotion that shows up when we're thinking about the future. And we know, and that's why I call the book Future Tense, actually, not because it's about the grammar of mental health. We're thinking about the future. And when we're anxious, we know that something bad could happen. I'm thinking about that upcoming test. I could flunk it. I don't feel prepared. I'm feeling all these feelings. It could go badly. But when you're anxious, you actually still believe that a good outcome is possible. So a student who's anxious about a test still believes they can do something about it because otherwise they would be despairing. They would have already given up. So this gives us something to work with. And it's a temporary feeling. It's not a disorder. So when we have other temporary feelings like joy, we don't get nervous that, we know now when a lot of young people, when they talk about anxiety, they say, oh, it's going to spiral. It's going to spiral out of control. I get really afraid whenever I feel it. But we don't feel afraid of other emotions. We don't feel afraid of joy. We're just like, oh my gosh, I better I better tamp down on that joy because it might spiral out of control. We don't talk about it that way. And we shouldn't talk that way about anxiety because in anxiety, it is an emotion, it rises, it falls, it has a chronicity to it. And it's on a spectrum, as this picture shows. It goes from, kind of like a little butterflies in the stomach, low level intensity, all the way to full-blown panic. And it also is on a spectrum of positivity to negativity. So I'm anxious about my upcoming wedding preparations, then I'm also anxious about something bad that could happen. So it describes all of these experiences. And the powerful thing about anxiety is that it lives in this space between where we are now and where we want to be. We always think anxiety is about threat, but it's also about hope. The flip side of anxiety is hope, because when we're anxious, we are still in it to win it. We are still capable in our minds of affecting change in the world. I mean, that's all that worry is. It's our attempt to control the future. So anxiety has that advantage to it. And as an emotion, we all have it. We're all born anxious. And often people say, oh no, I'm falling apart because I have anxiety. But we can very honestly say in response, well, good, I have anxiety too. What are we going to do about it? So it's not something that we have or don't. It is the human condition, because it shows up when there's something uncertain that we have to navigate. That's why when Dr. Scott Parazynski was in space doing this incredible thing for 7 hours, it was anxiety that drove him the entire time, plus hope, plus training, plus optimism, and all these other things. But anxiety also drove him because it allowed him to believe that, yes, I have to avert disaster, but I have to still work to make the positive outcome into reality. And anxiety and all of our emotions do this because they give us information and preparation. Anxiety gives us information about the uncertain future, and it tells us what we are caring about in that future. You're only anxious when you care. And it tells you the bad stuff you want to avoid, and it tells you about the good stuff you want to make happen. And Charles Darwin, a third of his theory was devoted to emotion, as a matter of fact. It was the origin of species, the descent of man, and the expression of emotion in man and animals. So he talked about this incredible information that anxiety gives us, all the emotions he talked about, combined with preparation. Once you have that information, it prepares you to act upon it. And so before I get, and the acting upon it is the leveraging, which is the second L. And I just want to share a quick little exercise to think about when we try to listen to anxiety, and when we have a vocabulary of why it's important to listen to anxiety. And that's this idea that really came out of, emerged out of Buddhism, this idea of practicing beginner's mind, right? And so as a paraphrase, in the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities, but in the expert's mind, there are few. And that's how we are, I think, when it comes to coping with our anxiety and other emotions we feel overwhelmed by, right? So that when we think we know what we feel, how we are, how we cope with it, we have a limited repertoire. But when we open our mind about anxiety, all of a sudden, all the possibilities expand as well. So every time that we or our students or our loved ones were feeling strong feelings, facing a challenge, we should be curious and objective. because it expands the possible solutions we have at our fingertips. So you start and you pretend you know nothing about yourself, right? So you literally do the exercise. Who is this person I'm observing? What are they feeling now? Just be completely open. And as you're being open or helping a student be open, you have to listen for those assumptions, that little negative, often it's a negative voice in our head. Oh, you're always someone who falls apart when you have to take a test. You're always someone. So you have to listen for some of these assumptions, see what you're telling yourself, even if you're not fully aware. And then assess, is that true? Do I fall apart at every single exam? Are there things that I'm really good at around exams? What is it, what is it that I haven't done with this exam? Maybe there's only one type of problem or topic that I don't feel expert enough in. Maybe that's where the weakness is, and I just need to study more in that section. These are the kinds of conversations when we listen to anxiety that we can start to figure out what to do next and how to leverage that information, right? So is there something I can do with that information? What's my intention? So when we go through those, of course, that exercise, the next step is leverage. And really, just to remind you of the scenario, again, this is a student who's overwhelmed, the final exam coming up. This is where you can start to say, okay, you're anxious. What is it? What are you anxious about? Not just the test. What about it? Specific types of problems. You don't have enough time to study because you're working 2 jobs. What is it that you actually need in this moment, right? What is it anxiety is telling you is not right, is leading to disaster, but, and that you can change to presumably, hopefully do something that allows you to take productive action. And that is something I think of as future tense thinking, where you're really thinking forward to saying, what is it that not only is what is anxiety telling me, but what is it focusing me on as the important thing? And that's really the gift it gives us. That's why it's so unpleasant, because it has to make us sit up and pay attention. And here we can kind of think of the classic Yerkes-Dodson law, right? This idea that there's optimal arousal. We have to remember that when we feel that anxiety, if we can keep it within this sort of optimal level, and that depends on how difficult the task is, right? You can have more like distress if it's an easy task versus a difficult task, right? But whatever the case, how do we really get ourselves to be able to use that anxiety as sort of a jet fuel to know what's important, articulate the best and worst possible outcomes so we can actually make plans, take actions now and later to ensure that best outcome, to study what I need to study if I don't have a lot of time to do better on the test, to find a study buddy, to avail myself of office hours. It's only when we actually get through the miasma of anxiety, when it's all diffuse and we haven't listened to it, to actually get to actionable strategies that we can really start to do something and help our students do the same. And it also allows us to understand what can I control and what can't I. So it helps us make wise decisions about what to do with that anxiety, how to really prepare and take meaningful action, because we can't just think pie in the sky. We have to think realistically. And so this is the kind of process that leveraging anxiety kind of knowing that we can do it allows us to think through. And it requires something that's hard to come by these days, because a lot of the conversations young people and we are having about mental health and anxiety is that we are broken. We feel very traumatized. Trauma is a word everyone throws around a lot, even for relatively small things, but it shows how fragile that we feel. But when it comes to mental health, I think the single most important idea that we have to reclaim is this idea of anti-fragility. And you might remember the book that Nassim Nicholas Taleb wrote 15 or so years ago now, even longer maybe. About 10 or 12 years ago, called Anti-Fragile, Things That Gain from Disorder. And what he argued, and he thought about things like economic systems and societies and corporations, but there are things and systems that grow stronger because of stress and strain, not despite it. He likened anti-fragility to a Greek, the Greek mythology, to the creature, the Hydra versus the Phoenix. So the Phoenix is resilience. The Phoenix bursts into flames and comes back stronger than ever before, kind of back to where it started. Whereas the Hydra, you cut off one head and 2 grow in its place. It grows stronger through the adversity, through that challenge. And there are a lot of systems that are that way in human beings. The immune system is anti-fragile because unless you throw germs and bacteria at it, our bodies will not learn to mount an optimal immune response. And we may even start to find that there are a series of autoimmune problems that develop. So we have to challenge the immune system. Muscles, we know, we take it as not even under question that we have to strain and work them to build strength in muscles. Otherwise, they'll atrophy. And the fact is, emotions are the same. Unless we actually engage with and work through emotions and are sometimes really challenged and uncomfortable, we will never learn how to cope with them. And so our job as human beings, for ourselves, as a community member to support others, is to prepare people for difficult emotions, for anxiety, not protect them. Protection is actually one of the least helpful things we can do. That's not to say that people in the world are not truly traumatized, do not suffer from things like post-traumatic stress disorder, and need buffers. But even the gold standard treatments for PTSD requires that we scaffold and support people in working through their anxieties and their difficult experiences. So there's no condition under which complete protection, not allowing people to do difficult things, that is never a treatment approach that psychological science points to. And so there are things we can do in the classroom, in our lives, that we don't usually think of as good things. But these are skills that actually build anti-fragility. Now, of course, being flexible is good. We know that we have to, do things differently sometimes. Taking chances, questioning our assumptions, and celebrating mistakes. And one thing I'm going to talk about in the next slide is how in the classroom, mistakes can be so choking for our students. They can really, the fear of a mistake can stop them from developing skills, from taking chances. Here's where we can, when we think about anti-fragility and embracing it, we can start to do small things, even just tiny things in the classroom, to build more anti-fragility, flexibility. And celebrating mistakes is one of those, and learning from them. KISS is keeping it simple. So knowing that we have to get something simple correct and then build on it rather than go from 0 to 100. These are things that help us gain from those challenges, from adversity, from things not working out the first time. You learn from success and do more of those things. Don't reinvent the wheel. Learn from failures and do fewer of those things. These are very simple things, but when we place them in the context of anti-fragility, we start to see how we're becoming almost like emotional ninjas when it comes to handling challenges, mistakes, our fears. We begin to think of them as necessary bumps on the road as we build a positive state of mental health, because mental health is not the absence of emotional discomfort. Mental health is the ability to actually struggle, to work through, to fall down sometimes, and then get back up. Now, one thing I've been thinking a lot about making mistakes in class, and I'm teaching a small section of a 300 class this semester, Psychology 323, which is writing intensive. And for 323 is developmental psychopathology, which is essentially the development of mental illness in children and across development. And what I find, because a lot of the projects, there's PowerPoint presentations and there's a final paper and there's a lot of class discussion and more seminar style required. The biggest sources of anxiety that I'm seeing is discomfort in not knowing an answer, feeling judged as being stupid, right? If you get something wrong, and feeling unprepared. And so a lot of students shut down automatically. And so one thing that I've tried to do in my class, and I start with the power of the elevator pitch, because I think it's a good metaphor for a lot of things we do, is that I try to scaffold my students towards their big final assignment, which is a final paper which is essentially an APA, American Psychological Format paper. That's a research proposal that's really kind of taking it up a notch in terms of developing their writing skills and their thinking skills. And I use the elevator pitch as a part of this process because of a couple things. First, as you know, an elevator pitch is being able to summarize succinctly and compellingly an idea or a project in just 60 seconds or less, the time it takes to go up an elevator. And what I've done with my students, and we do this in various ways, and writing versions of this and speaking versions of this, is we just go for it. People get up and they'll maybe speak in front of class as one version of this, and they just off the top of their head try. And it's beautiful when it's imperfect. And I tell them I want it to be imperfect because now we're going to workshop this together as a class. And so this idea that making mistakes is actually a necessary step on the way to success. It's something that I'm sure many of you already do this, but it's a way to build in these techniques into the day-to-day culture of a classroom that starts to accept and bolster our kids, our students rather, excuse me, ability to take these chances. And then, you know, and by varieties of elevator pitches, that is a William James reference, but it's also just that we can do this in so many ways. It can be in a written assignment where we do revisions and we take chances and we revise, and we learn the beauty of revising and having a really bad first draft. These are all things that I think of as not just good pedagogical strategies, but actually good emotional strategies and mental health. I'm going to move on because I know I think we have about 10 minutes left, and I want to leave at least five or so minutes for Q&A. But there's an article I wrote in the Washington Post a little while back earlier this year about how we can actually use worry, not with the goal of eradicating worries. You probably have already guessed that that's not something I would advocate, but to worry smarter. And of course, when we do worry smarter, we tend to worry less anyway. So it's a win-win. And I can definitely send this link if people are interested, but there are these 4 steps where you're allowing worries to come, you're containing them, you're giving them words, you're saying, oh, I only have 15 minutes to worry, write it all down. But however, you're making it tractable, right? You're containing, but you're allowing them to come. You're describing them concretely. What's the worst thing that can happen? What's the best thing? Don't forget the best. That's really important to articulate. And prioritize. What are the worries? What can I think about now? As soon as you make plans or take action, worries always diminish, telling us that we're on the right track. And it's crucial not to worry alone, because social connection, receiving it as well as giving it, right? Moving past our navel gazing and really giving others support as well is one of the best ways to cope with all of our mental health challenges. So the last section is really quick because it's honestly something we all already know how to do. It's about letting go. We've tried listening and leveraging. We can't spend all this time in the future tense, right? Worrying about the uncontrollable, uncertain future. We have to get balance and come back to the present, because we're mental time travelers. So flexibility and agility, that's the key to mental health, to be able to go forward and back and have that kind of flexibility. And each of us has these tools, and our students do as well. And it's not anything fancy. It's not rocket science. It's things that create a sense of flow and purpose. And I can tell you, all the good science out there says that probably the first thing we should all do is exercise, because exercise and the wellness of our body actually addresses a lot of our mental health, especially anxiety and depression. But, you know, that can be one tool in our toolkit, reaching out and giving back to community, nature, sports, music, like all of these techniques. We know that these are powerful ways to come back to the present and let go of those worries and find rejuvenation. And I have another WashPo article that came out a little while back that we don't have time to go into now. I could discuss it in Q&A if people like, but it's essentially letting go of one of the biggest drivers of anxiety, which is perfectionism. And as Thomas Edison said, he was not a perfectionist, though. He was an excellencist. He let go of perfection and knew that you can get to excellent, but you have to make mistakes along the way. He said, I haven't failed 1,000 times. I've just found 1,000 ways that don't work yet. So in summary, in conclusion, some take homes to remember is that we're all born anxious. Anxiety is an emotion. It's the human condition because it shows up when we're uncertain. It has to feel bad to do its job, to make us sit up and pay attention, to know what we care about, to know what's possibly bad in the future, but also good. And it shows up not to choke us, but to help us thrive in the face of uncertainty. Avoiding anxiety always makes it worse. And when we prepare for rather than protect from anxiety, we can learn from it. We can harness it to take productive, purposeful action in our life. And we can, in the moment when we're struggling with what to do, we can remember these 3 L's as a sort of mindset reset: listen, leverage, and let go. Now, I'm coming back to this in the 30 seconds before we end. Okay, who saw a rabbit and who saw a duck? I think actually rabbit might be the most common, but whatever the case, why am I showing you this optical illusion? I'm showing it because this is a mindset, right? This is a perspective. Once, we may have come in thinking that anxiety is a duck, that anxiety is a certain way. But once we see that anxiety can also be a rabbit, can be an ally, can be something different than we thought it could be, we can never unsee it. Just like now, you cannot unsee that duck or unsee that rabbit once you've seen it. And so once we see things in different ways like this, we gain this incredible freedom to choose. So I'm not asking you, and that brings new possibilities and solutions. So I'm not asking you to love anxiety. Do not love it. Don't even like it, but honor it. Consider when it shows up in your class, at home, in your life, that it's there to give us information and preparation, and that we can reclaim it. And then when we do reclaim it as a normal part of being human, we are empowered more than we ever would when we reject it to actually start to use it to make our life better. So I'll end with that. And this is the book that Julie mentioned that I wrote a little while back. And thank you very much for your attention.